It's my great pleasure to welcome as our Pitt lecturer for 2021, the Reverend Dr. Patrick Cheng. We've given the usual biographical outline of Father Cheng's achievements in the bulletin for your later reading, but I want to acknowledge that Father Cheng has been a friend to Berkeley, and I would claim personally as well for some years, and it is a great pleasure to have him here. He's a priest who combines a deep pastoral heart and a real grounding in the tradition of the Episcopal Church and Anglicanism, with ideas and commitments that also stretch our capacities and help us to think in new and different ways. And as someone who is very much a both-and thinker to my mind, it was a great pleasure for me when he accepted our invitation to undertake the Pitt lecture. As a couple of obvious signs of his remarkable versatility and skill, for one thing, he's a graduate of both Harvard and Yale, which is sort of like squaring a circle or something like that, as well as of the Union Theological Seminary. And he engages in ministry not only at St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue, but also in the Church Pension Group as one of its leading lawyers working in compliance. And I've yet to actually work out the specific theological connection between some of these hermeneutical issues and compliance, Patrick, but perhaps we can hear about that later. But it is a great pleasure to welcome him, and would you join me in welcoming the Reverend Patrick Cheng, who will give the Pitt lecture.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'm the Reverend Dr. Patrick Cheng, and I'm honored to deliver the 2021 Pitt lecture at this year's Berkeley Divinity School Convocation. The title of my lecture is Race and Sexuality in the Regions Beyond, Towards a Post-Colonial Queer Missiology. Before I begin, I'd like to thank everyone who is here this afternoon at Christ Church, New Haven, as well as everyone who is joining us by Zoom or watching this lecture as a recording. And a big thank you to Dean McGowan for the invitation to deliver this lecture. As you may know, the Lewis Weatherby Pitt Lecture is given every other year by, quote, distinguished preachers and world Christians. Now, I don't know if I'm a distinguished preacher or not, but I do consider myself to be a world Christian. I was actually born and baptized in the former British colony of Hong Kong. Here's a photo of my family and me on my first birthday. I'm at the center of the photo. I'm surrounded by my parents and my maternal grandparents, Waigong and Waipo. And shortly after this photo was taken, my family immigrated to the United States, and so I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I've returned to Hong Kong twice during the past decade to preach, teach, and minister to LGBTQ Christians from across Asia. Here's a photo of me with the participants in the 2014 Queer Theology Academy, hosted by the Changchi Divinity School at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. This afternoon, I'd like to explore with you how race and sexuality were constructed in the far-flung regions of the British Empire during the 19th century. My thesis is that the construction of the racial and sexual other during the height of British imperialism continues to influence how we interact with each other in the Anglican Communion today. To that end, I'd like to propose the outline of a post-colonial queer missiology that can help us to live out the Missio Dei, or mission of God, in a communion that has been openly and deeply divided over issues of race and sexuality for nearly a quarter of a century. My lecture is divided into 4 parts. The first part will examine the traditional model of mission. The second part will look at how race was constructed in the regions beyond of the British Empire. The third part will look at how sexuality was constructed in those regions. And the fourth and final part will propose an alternative model of mission that might speak better to the current divisions over race and sexuality in the Anglican Communion. So let us begin with the traditional model of mission. My starting point is actually the motto of Berkeley Divinity School. Now, did you know that the BDS motto is actually about mission? The motto, which appears in Latin at the bottom of the school seal, is In illaque ultra sunt. And the English translation of the motto, as most of you know, is Into the regions beyond. Now, here's a literal translation of the Latin motto. Interestingly, the word regions does not appear in the translation. The translation simply reads, into those that beyond are. And that's because the word regions is implicit in the word illa. Now, as I mentioned, the BDS motto is about mission. And the motto is taken from chapter 10, verse 16 of the second letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Now, this is the section of the epistle in which Paul angrily denounces the sarcastically named super-apostles who have infiltrated his beloved church in Corinth and who have turned the members of that church against him. Now, as you may recall, these unnamed super-apostles considered themselves to be missionaries to the Corinthians. And they were not connected, however, with Paul or the original apostles. Now, in verses 15 and 16 of this section, St. Paul distinguishes himself from these super-apostles. As you can see in the NRSV text on the left side of this slide, Paul refuses to boast or to take credit for the missionary labors of others. Rather, Paul hopes that he will be the first person to proclaim the gospel in the lands beyond where the Corinthians are located. And this is where the BDS motto, into the regions beyond, appears. You can see the Latin text of the motto, In illaque ultra sunt, in the Vulgate translation on the right. In other words, Paul tells his beloved church in Corinth that unlike the super-apostles, he will do his missionary work in places that have not yet been touched by someone else's sphere of action. Now, this passage from 2 Corinthians, and by extension, the BDS motto, is a classic example of the geographical model of mission. In such a model, mission is understood as an activity that occurs across physical space. Specifically, Paul talks about bringing the good news of Jesus Christ from here to the regions beyond. My former Episcopal Divinity School faculty colleague, Professor Christopher DeRising, has noted how the traditional model of mission is geographical in nature. In a chapter from the Beyond Colonial Anglicanism anthology, edited by Bishop Ian Douglas and Professor Kwok Pui-Lan, DeRising writes, traditionally, the primary missionary frontier is geographical. Such a frontier lies out there beyond the home front, often overseas. It is the mission primarily shaped by the territorial from-to idea. The goal of mission is seen essentially as the physical extension and numerical increase of the church. Now, missionary work is not the only place in which one sees the geographical movement of going from here to the regions beyond. This is actually the same movement that underlies the imperial enterprise. Here's a map of the British Empire that was published in 86. You can see that England is at the center of the map, and the colonies radiate outwards from the metropolis into the regions beyond. I love this. This is a 19th century American political cartoon. And England is characterized here as a greedy octopus-like creature with tentacles that literally reach out to the regions beyond. You can see the sort of various lands here that the octopus is grabbing. Now, it should come as no surprise, therefore, that Anglicanism was closely aligned with the British Empire. Professor Rowan Strong of Murdoch University in Australia has commented on the symbiotic relationship between missiology and colonialism. In his book, Anglicanism and the British Empire, Strong writes, Anglicanism was institutionally, consciously, evangelicalistically, and organizationally connected and concerned with the English-British Empire since the beginning of the 18th century. To be so, Anglicanism needed to understand the empire religiously as a theological missionary imperative. In other words, Anglicanism could not be separated from empire. In fact, Anglican missiology and the traditional geographical model of mission was used to justify the very existence of empire. Let us now turn to the second part of this lecture. That is how race was constructed in the regions beyond in the British Empire. We begin with a photograph of a British official in India who is seated on a balcony, shirtless, and receiving a pedicure from his Indian servant. At the same time, the official is being fanned by another servant. I invite you to take a moment and reflect upon the power dynamic expressed in this photo and how the servants are portrayed. Next, we have a photograph of another British official in India who is being transported by 4 Indian servants. Again, take a moment to reflect upon the power dynamic expressed in the photo and the portrayal of the servants. In both photographs, race is a key marker of difference, not only with respect to the power dynamic of dominance and submission, but also with respect to the dichotomy of civilized versus primitive. The close connection between race and colonialism is helpfully summarized by the authors of Postcolonial Studies, The Key Concepts. They write, race is particularly pertinent to the rise of colonialism because the division of human society in this way is inextricable from the need of colonialist powers to establish a dominance over subject peoples and hence justify the imperial enterprise. Racialized thinking and colonialism are imbued with the same impetus to draw a binary distinction between civilized and primitive, and the same necessity for the hierarchization of human types. Now, returning to our late 19th century map of the British Empire, I'd like to call your attention to the margins, specifically to the illustrations that are displayed on the map's borders. It might be a little hard to see, especially if you're back there, but I've tried to mark in a red circle certain parts of this map. And the illustrations are much more than just decorations. They provide a window into the 19th century British psyche about how it perceived the racialized other from the regions beyond. So let me zoom in on some of these pictures. In the center of the slide, you see the image of Britannia, the personification of England. And Britannia has ivory white skin, and she wears a helmet and holds a spear, not unlike a crown and scepter, or perhaps even a mitre and a crozier. And like the photos that we saw earlier, the inhabitants of the regions beyond that surround Britannia are depicted as being servile and or primitive. So starting from the upper right-hand corner and moving clockwise, you first see a woman from Asia carrying tea on a tray, as well as a paper fan. Next, you see a bare-chested Aboriginal woman from Australia holding a boomerang. Then you see a half-clothed woman from Africa holding a fan of palms. Moving clockwise, you see a woman from the Caribbean with a scarf-covered head who is holding a fan of peacock feathers. You then see a man from India wearing a turban and sitting on an elephant. Finally, you see an indigenous man from North America wearing a headdress of feathers and holding arrows in his hand. It's amazing, right? I mean, this image is from over a century ago, and yet so many of these stereotypes in our construction of races and other parts of the world have continued today. But I think what is more disturbing, but not surprising, is that Britannia is sitting on a globe. Can you see the globe here? And it's marked world. And Britannia is flanked on either side by the woman from the Caribbean and the woman from Africa. And like the Indian servant who was fanning the British officer who was getting the pedicure, remember that photo? Both of these women are fanning Britannia to keep her comfortable and cool. So the power dynamic of dominance and submission between Britannia and the two colonized women from the regions beyond is mapped here by the red triangle that is superimposed upon the image. Now, interestingly, the same racialized power dynamic appears in the photograph of the British officer and the 4 servants who are carrying him. And again, we see this power dynamic in the photo of the British officer who is getting a pedicure and his 2 servants. And we see this dynamic in the illustration that I showed at the beginning of my lecture of a British officer who is literally being supported and carried to shore by 2 native individuals. Now, lest you think that racialized power dynamic of dominance and submission existed only in earlier times and faraway places, here's the statue that currently stands at the front entrance of the Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The statue portrays President Teddy Roosevelt riding a horse and being flanked by 2 figures who are his gun carriers, and they are walking. The first figure is a Native American, and the second figure is a person of African descent. Now, this statue, which was commissioned in 1925 and installed in 1940, has stood in front of the Museum of Natural History for some 8 decades. Now, despite decades of controversy, I believe since the 1970s, if not before, and the recent Black Lives Matter movement, it was only this past June when the museum and the New York City Public Design Commission finally agreed to remove the statue somewhere else. However, the statue is still there 4 months later because no specific date for the removal has yet been announced. So we now turn to the third part of this lecture, which is the construction of sexuality in the regions beyond. We've talked about race. Let's also look at how sexuality has been constructed. And as with race, sexuality was used by the colonizers. Sexuality was used by the colonizers to depict the inhabitants of the colonized lands as some kind of radical other, right? Some kind of strange, exotic other. Dr. Rudy Blaze, who is an independent scholar in the Netherlands, has described this dynamic as the geography of perversion. I love that notion, geography of perversion. And in his book, with the title Geography of Perversion, Blaise writes, the tropes of homophobia in post-colonial politics coincided with the epoch of imperialism, and both were mutually intertwined. Non-Western sexualities were read, interpreted, and represented as a limitless repository of deviance, extravagance, and eccentricity, aiming simultaneously at the marginalization of cultural and sexual minorities. Now, ironically, while the colonizers were busy characterizing the colonized as sexual outsiders, the colonizers themselves were engaging in sexual acts that would have been criminalized at home. In his book, Homosexuality, Colonialism and Homosexuality, Professor Robert Aldrich of the University of Sydney noted that geography was often used as an excuse for sexual misbehavior. He writes, in Europe, life was full of dichotomies, respectable versus immoral behavior, natural and unnatural sex, homosexual versus heterosexual acts. In the colonies, things were different. Misbehavior, so long as it was relatively discreet, would be tolerated since the global positioning of the sotatic zone excused misbehavior. Infra equinoxialum nihil peccari. There is no sin below the equator. The age of consent of a bedfellow did not seem a matter of great concern, nor was expectation of compensation for sexual favors a surprise. Beer and rum, drugs and heat lowered inhibitions. I love the phrase infra equinoxialum nihil peccari. There is no sin below the equator. Think of it as a 19th century version in Latin of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Seriously, though, one of the more bizarre elements of the geography of perversion was the sotatic zone that was referenced by Aldrich. Did you catch that? He referenced the sotatic zone. And the concept of the sotatic zone was invented by the 19th century British explorer and translator, Sir Richard Francis Burton. Now, Burton believed that the vices of sodomy and other prohibited sexual acts were particularly prevalent in the sotatic zone due to the warm climate. So Burton wrote, within the sotatic zone, the vice, with a capital V, is popular and endemic, held at the worst to be a mere peccadillo, whilst the races to the north and south of the limits here defined practice it only sporadically amid the opprobrium of their fellows who, as a rule, are physically incapable of performing the operation and look upon it with the liveliest of disgust. Now, where is the sotatic zone, you might ask? Well, on this slide, you can see that the sotatic zone encompasses all of the areas marked in red. That is roughly 43 degrees north of the equator to 30 degrees south of the equator, but also including most of East Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as all of North America and South America. So I bet you never knew that New Haven was located in the sotatic zone, did you? A brief postscript about Burton. Although he was married to a woman, it is said that he had a particular interest in conducting undercover missions to research male brothels that were frequented by British soldiers in the regions beyond. Not surprisingly, his wife burned all of his papers after he died. The sotatic zone was not the only element of the geography of perversion. Colonial explorers also took an interest in cataloging the sexual acts of local inhabitants in the regions beyond. For example, a book called L'Art d'aimer aux colonies, or The Art of Love in the Colonies, was published anonymously in 1893 by a certain Dr. Jacobus X. And Professor Robert Aldrich described the work as follows. The book provides an inventory of sex as practiced in indigenous, non-European societies. It is specious anthropology and sexology, marked by imperialist assumptions, racialist scientific views, and the author's personal prejudices, voyeuristic soft-porn masquerading as scientific study. In constructing the sexual other, authors such as Dr. Jacobus X perpetuated race-based stereotypes that remain with us to this day. Aldrich noted, racialist and racist stereotypes abounded. Romanticization and idealization of foreign cultures, or conversely, denigration of them, were common, along with wild fantasies, homoerotic writing and art lauding the physical attributes of foreign men participated in race-based stereotyping. Relations of power permeated colonial sexual culture. So to summarize, a key factor in the development of the British Empire was sexual desire. And I find it fascinating that with all the discussion of global imperialism, we don't hear about this often, right? I mean, that is not just the sexual desire of those who inhabited the regions beyond, but also the sexual desire of the British colonizers. And in his book, Empire and Sexuality, Professor Ronald Higham of Cambridge University wrote, "It is quite impossible to understand the nature of the British Empire or the dynamics of British expansion overseas without taking account of the sexual attitudes and expectations of the men who were in charge, and men, as we've seen so far. The sexual structures they encountered or created or adapted have to be built integrally into the imperial picture if it is to be, in any sense, a true one." So we now turn to the fourth and final part of this lecture. In this part, I will propose an alternative model of mission that can help us to carry out Missio Dei, or the mission of God, in our own particular time and place. Specifically, I would like to propose an alternative model of mission, a paradigm shift, if you will, that would move away from the traditional model of mission in the Anglican Communion. Specifically, this alternative model would move away from the traditional geographical model of mission. Remember from before I was talking about the geographical model, from here to there, to the regions beyond, if you will. Instead, this model would move towards a missiology of reconciliation and deeper encounter. In other words, going into the regions beyond would be less about traveling through physical space and more about having a deeper encounter with the other within. Now, contemporary missiologists have noted that reconciliation is a central aspect of Missio Dei. For example, in an essay that Bishop Douglas wrote about God's mission and the Anglican Communion, he argued that the focus of Missio Dei should be on the reconciliation of all people to unity with God and each other in Christ. This focus on reconciliation is particularly appropriate in light of the ongoing divisions in the Anglican Communion over race and sexuality. These divisions have existed openly for at least a quarter of a century, not openly for much longer, beginning with Resolution 110 from the 1998 Lambeth Conference, which expressly rejected homosexual practice as being incompatible with Scripture, and Resolution 110 also rejected the blessing of same-sex unions, as well as the ordination of those in such relationships. Now, interestingly, just this past Friday, right, just a few days ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement about the upcoming 2022 Lambeth Conference and the ongoing divisions in the Anglican Communion. And in his statement, Archbishop Welby expressly noted that the Communion aspires to a post-colonial model of church. Right, I was reading over the statement, and I noticed this reference to post-colonial model in the middle of the statement. I thought, oh gosh, how appropriate. I'll put it into my presentation. And he wrote, "The deep divisions derive in many ways from the structure of the Anglican Communion and the need for a continued journey towards a post-colonial model of global church. We are called to find ways of continuing together, and where we disagree, disagreeing well." Now, aspiring to a post-colonial ecclesiology and disagreeing well is a lovely goal. However, it doesn't change the painful fact that the same-sex spouses of at least 5 bishops, who are shown on this slide, remain excluded from the upcoming Lambeth Conference. And this exclusion seems particularly callous, or dare I say cruel, in light of the fact that the conference's program expressly includes the spouses of all the other bishops, including one of my bishops from the Diocese of New York and other friends. So it's clear to me that we need an alternative model of mission that can help us to reconcile with one another over issues of race and sexuality in the Anglican communion. How then can we construct an alternative missiology that is grounded in reconciliation and deeper encounter? Now, one approach, believe it or not, might be to draw from the insights of post-colonial queer theory. Now, this may sound very exotic to you. How many of you are familiar with post-colonial queer theory? Okay, well, not so exotic. I mean, this is Yale after all, right? Since the early 1990s, queer scholars of color and others have been doing important work in the intersections of both post-colonial and queer thought. And here are some key works in this area, in addition to the books that I have previously referenced in this lecture. And in my view, the insights of post-colonial queer theory can actually help us. You can translate theory into praxis to find areas of agreement that might actually lead us towards a missio Dei of reconciliation and deeper encounter. So initially, it might sound a little odd, but I would like to propose what I call 3 post-colonial queer practices that might help us reach that goal. 1, first, question the obvious. Second, let the marginalized speak. Third, embrace backwardness. So first, question the obvious. You know I couldn't have done a presentation without a reference to The Wizard of Oz, right? So as Dorothy and her friends in The Wizard of Oz realize, things are not always what they seem, right? Sometimes the great and powerful Oz is nothing more than a fraudster or a con man behind the curtain. Now take, for example, the division between East and West. Now, most people think of this dichotomy to be obvious and a fact of nature. I mean, who among us, myself included, hasn't at some point engaged in binary thinking about the exoticism and mystery of the Orient on the one hand, and the familiarity and transparency of the West on the other? But the Orient is actually not a fact of nature, right? As the editors of Postcolonial Studies, the key concepts have written, Orientalism is a supreme example of the construction of the other, a form of authority. The Orient is not an inert fact of nature, but a phenomenon constructed by generations of intellectuals, artists, commentators, writers, politicians, and more importantly, constructed by the naturalizing of a wide range of Orientalist assumptions and stereotypes. In other words, what appears to be obvious and natural as a result of repetition over generations is actually a means of exercising control over the other. Now, this is the insight, of course, that gave rise to postcolonial theory in the late 1970s. In his groundbreaking book, Orientalism, the late Professor Edward Said of Columbia University argued that the Orient is less about the natural order of things and more about a mechanism of domination. Now, for Said, the Orient referred to the Middle East, of course, instead of East Asia. But Said wrote, Orientalism deals with the Orient, and as an academic study, most importantly, by making statements about it, authorizing views about it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Now, Said's critique of Orientalism should be familiar to many of you, perhaps more than post-colonial queer studies is. But what is less well known is that Said actually credits one of the foundational, or should I say anti-foundational figures of queer theory, Michel Foucault, for his work. So I find this a really fascinating connection between post-colonial and queer theory. Said wrote, "I have found it useful here to employ Michel Foucault's notion of a discourse, as described by him in The Archaeology of Knowledge and in Discipline and Punish, to identify Orientalism." So what does all this have to do with the Christian gospel? To paraphrase Tertullian, what does the Athens of post-colonial queer thought have to do with the Jerusalem of missiology? Well, actually quite a lot. If you think about it, questioning the obvious, right? Questioning the obvious is at the heart of what we profess as Christians. From the perspective of the gospel, things are never what they seem. The world teaches us that there's no life after death. The world teaches us that we do not need to take care of others, every person for themselves. And the world teaches us that we can accomplish anything if we only try hard enough. But the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ turns upside down what seems obvious to the world. In fact, death is never the last word. In fact, we are all part of one body and thus interdependent on the other. And in fact, we are saved not by our own works, but only by the grace of God. Question the obvious. Second, let the marginalized speak. Professor Gayatri Spivak of Columbia University is perhaps the leading post-colonialist theorist of today. Among other things, her work focuses on the subaltern, or the most marginalized elements of society. In her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Professor Spivak notes that the voices of the marginalized are rarely present in the conversations that are about them. Right? So in discussing the practice, this is really fascinating, about widow sacrifice in India, right? Spivak writes, "The Hindu widow ascends the pyre of the dead husband and immolates herself upon it. This is widow sacrifice. The abolition of this right by the British has been generally understood as a case of white men saving brown women from brown men, right? White men saving brown women from brown men. But against this is the Indian nativist argument, a parody of the nostalgia for lost origins. The women actually wanted to die." And Spivak says that these two sentences go a long way to legitimize each other. One never encounters the testimony of the woman's voice consciousness. And in her essay, Spivak raises this key question: how is it possible to discuss, let alone pass legislation about the practice of sati without listening to the voices of those who are most impacted by it? Now, it's not surprising that church-related debates about racial or sexual minorities often exclude the very voices of the individuals who are being discussed. Although the conversations may be about us, we are not invited to the table. Think, for example, Resolution 110 from the 1998 Lambeth Conference, or even say the decision to exclude same-sex spouses from the 2022 Lambeth Conference. And this silencing is particularly true for queer people of color. In his book, Ceremonies, Essex Hemphill, the late gay African-American poet and activist, talked about how many queer black folk are unable to speak their truth. Hemphill wrote, "I speak for the thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, who live and die in the shadows of secrets, unable to speak of the love that helps them endure and contribute to the race. This is what the race has depended on in being able to erase homosexuality from our recorded history." Now, Hemphill wrote Ceremonies way back in 1992. But his basic point is still applicable to other sexual and gender minorities, including non-binary, transgender, and intersex persons of color. Now, giving voice to the marginalized is a central aspect of the gospel. In fact, it could be said that much of Jesus Christ's life was lifting up the marginalized and dispossessed. Instead of magnifying the voices of the wealthy and powerful, Jesus interacted with the outcast, the unclean, and the least among us. Jesus' encounter with the Syrophoenician woman was one example of this practice. Right? She was deemed to be unclean by society on multiple levels. Even Jesus was reluctant at first to listen to her, but he relented when she ultimately talked back to him. "Sir," she said, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And so he listened to her and healed her daughter. Let the marginalized speak. Third and finally, embrace backwardness. This sounds like kind of an odd thing, right? But in our forward-looking society, isn't it true that newer is always better, right? We are obsessed with technology, with progress, with productivity, and the shiniest new things. In recent decades, however, many critical theorists, particularly those in the realm of post-colonial and queer theory, have challenged our obsession with the future. Instead of worshiping at the altar of linear, that is straight time, such theorists have encouraged us to spiral backwards and embrace the past. Edward Said, for example, noted how themes of backwardness were used to justify the conquest and colonization of those who lived in the regions beyond. Again, think back to that 19th century map. Remember how all the portrayals of the different people and this idea that I think the one thing that ties them all together is their backwardness, right? As opposed to Britannia. Said wrote, "Theses of Oriental backwardness, degeneracy, and inequality with the West most easily associated themselves early in the 19th century with ideas about the biological bases of racial inequality. Thus, the whole question of imperialism carried forward the binary typology of advanced and backward, or subject races, cultures, and societies." You know, I really love this because I think all of these concepts, they really deconstruct the binary between race and sexuality. So much of the debate within the Anglican Communion is about one versus the other, but all of these post-colonial queer topics apply to both. And it is my hope that it can be sort of grounds for conversation, right? A deeper coming together instead of sort of either or, but the both and. And so not only Said, but the queer theorist, Professor Heather Love. I love Love's work. She's at the University of Pennsylvania. Love has argued that allegations of backwardness are often used to mark the other as inferior or deviant. And in her book, Feeling Backward, Loss in the Politics of Queer History, if you haven't read this book, I highly commend it to you. It weaves together temporality as well as queer theory and affect theory. Love writes, "Modernization perfected techniques for mapping and disciplining subjects considered to be lagging behind, and so seriously compromised the ability of these others ever to catch up. Not only sexual and gender deviants, but also women, colonized people, the non-white, the disabled, the poor, and criminals were marked as inferior by means of the allegation of backwardness." You know, it's not surprising that Jesus embraced backwardness in his ministry. He was born and raised in a backwater province on the edges of the Roman Empire. He did not call the popular, the trendy, the social elite, or the highly educated to be his disciples. Rather, he called lowly and uneducated fishermen like Peter, James, John, and Andrew to be his closest colleagues. As St. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians, "God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. And God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. Embrace backwardness. To summarize, I have proposed 3 post-colonial queer practices that might help us to move closer towards the Missio Dei of reconciliation. In a communion that is deeply divided by race and sexuality, it is my hope that these practices can help us to establish deeper relationships with whoever the other for us might be, right? So instead of talking about binaries and either or and demonizing the other, whoever our other is, perhaps these can be tools in which we can, go deeper. Question the obvious. Let the marginalized speak. And embrace backwardness. In recent years, a number of queer of color voices have emerged in the Episcopal Church and in the broader Anglican communion. All of the individuals on this slide are queer persons of color. They happen to be ordained folk, but also they're lay folk. But, these individuals on the slide have written about or wrestled deeply with issues of race and sexuality in their own ministries. And so if you are looking for a companion on your journey towards reconciliation and deeper encounter, especially in terms of issues of race and sexuality, I commend their work to you. I note in particular that the highly acclaimed documentary about the late Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, right? My Name is Pauli Murray, is right now available for home streaming. So we have reached the end of our journey through the constructions of race and sexuality in the regions beyond of the British Empire. In this lecture, I have suggested that we think of mission less in geographical terms and more in relational terms. In other words, going into the regions beyond is less about a physical journey out there and more about reconciliation and making a deeper internal connection with the other, whoever the other might be for us. And I have also suggested that certain post-colonial queer practices might help us to see what lies beneath the surface and to form deeper relationships with the other. And these practices included questioning the obvious, letting the marginalized speak, and embracing backwardness. It is my hope that such practices ultimately can help us form deeper connections between our siblings in the Episcopal Church, the broader Anglican communion, and the body of Christ. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this lecture. I hope that it has prompted you to reflect on what a post-colonial queer missiology might look like in your own life and in your own ministerial context.